Hi, good afternoon. I'm Bradley Graham, the co-owner of Politics Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and behalf of the entire P&P staff, welcome, and a special welcome to all the fathers in the audience. Um, when we were asked to host Luke Russert on Father's Day, we immediately accepted. I mean, it was like one of those no-brainers, right? His dad's book, Big Russ Me, was, of course, a bestseller when first published 10 years ago, and it's now been reissued with a new preface by Luke. Luke, of course, has followed in his dad, Tim's, gigantic footsteps. Luke joined NBC in 2008, just a few months after his dad's untimely death, and since then has worked as a correspondent based in Washington. He currently focuses on the House of Representatives, of all places. And as Luke and I were just discussing, not much news there this past week, right? And he's also done some guest hosting on several MSNBC programs. At the time Big Russ and Me initially came out, Luke was preparing to head to college. In the epilogue, Tim wrote that while the book was written for Tim's dad, he realized as he was finishing that it also was for Luke. He urged Luke to heed his grandfather's lessons of work, respect, and discipline, and to live a good, decent, and meaningful life. For Tim, fatherhood was even more of a passion than politics, or more even than his beloved Buffalo Bills. And Luke pays tribute to the great father Tim was. Luke writes in the preface, quote, "A day never went by that I didn't know my father loved me." But Tim's feeling for younger generations did not stop with his own son. He was keenly interested in improving the lives of all children, serving with groups that care for kids and often asking staff and friends how their children were doing. We remember Tim and his dad, Russ, as today we welcome Luke.
Thanks so much, Brad. That's a very kind introduction, and thank you all so much for coming to this event. It's a thrill for me personally because growing up here in Washington, D.C., I loved coming to Politics Prose because while my parents wouldn't always buy me a toy when I went out with them, they would always buy a book if I asked. So I would come here a fair amount, and it's kind of like the Madison Square Garden of independent bookstores on the East Coast, so it's a really great place to be. Thank you all for coming out here on this Saturday. I personally won't talk a lot. I prefer to interact with you guys with Q&A, so I'll just sort of give you a little idea of what I set out to do writing this book. A lot of folks talk about my father as a journalist and what he meant to not only television news, but I think American political journalism. And I think that was a really neat thing to sort of hear about over the years. And I realized sort of in the last few years that had sort of become his legacy, that of a hard-hitting, tough journalist, which is something he certainly would have liked. But one thing he always said is that when his time on Earth would be done, there'd be nothing more important to be judged on but what type of father he would be. And so, it's not surprisingly, ever since I ever went in front of a TV camera, a lot of people wanted me to write a book, and the way it works now, they go, "We'll write it all for you, and just slap your name on it, and we'll sell." And that never really appealed to me because I didn't think that was the right thing to do, and I just didn't want to do that. So I was approached on the 10-year anniversary, and they said, we want to put your dad's book back out, mainly because it's no longer in print. And I said, wow, I didn't know it was totally out of print and hard to get. And they also said, the publisher, if we re-release it, we can make it into an ebook. And so I said, well, I really want it to become an ebook because that's eventually how my generation will consume all their books. And they said, well, we'd like to do it. Would you mind adding a new preface? And I said yes. And it was something I put off doing. I sort of had the deadline, and I had it in big, bold, permanent markers right above my dresser. And I didn't want to do it, and I didn't want to get around to doing it. And then I realized I had to sit down and I had to reread this book, which is a wonderful thing to do. And I often read certain passages, but I had not read it through since right after my father had passed away. And as I started to go through it, I started to sort of weave a narrative in my mind about what I wanted to say. And I wrote the preface in one sitting. I took about 6.5, 7 hours at my kitchen table one night and just started going. And just all these ideas flowed out, and it was a very cathartic experience, one that I'm really glad and fortunate I was able to do, because it allowed me to compose my thoughts about how I felt as a son and what he meant to me, and put it in coherent terms. For someone who speaks on TV, I actually prefer writing because your meaning definitely comes out how you meant to say it. And sort of going back and going through the relationship, there was a few things I realized being 28 when I wrote it, and that's how old I am now. And the last time I ever saw my father, I was 22. And a lot has changed in the world over the last 6 years. But biggest for me was joining the TV media industry, as well as the sort of work spectrum. And what was interesting is I never quite realized just how important it was that my father gave me as much time as he did. It really made me a much better person, and it helped me to realize what the important things were in life. And that relationship to have, I didn't realize it until I was actually in TV news, was very hard for him to be able to pull off because he was so busy and his demands on his time were so immense. And it made me love him even more. I work now at NBC and in political journalism, and my schedule is not nearly as intense as his was. And I can't even imagine trying to raise a kid, especially in this current contemporary environment, with what the time constraints are. So that was something that really jumped out to me. The other thing that I talk about in the preface is it still happens all the time. As if I'm walking through an airport or if I'm at a restaurant and someone recognizes me, they immediately sort of bring up my father and they say, I love your father, I missed your father. And I was sort of trying to answer the question is why 6 years later does he still resonate with so many people? And certainly there's people in media, but TV media people in general, they go away, and not everyone necessarily remembers them, or writers, they go away. And what was it about him? And I sort of just discovered from talking to people and going back through this book is I think there is a everyman sense that gotta be a great guy to have a beer with, and he understood me. But watching how journalism operates in the TV world and seeing how it goes on a day-to-day basis, I realized that what my father was able to do was he was able to take the most difficult issues of the day, dwindle it down to speak that was in language that was understandable to people, and he also really held politicians accountable and didn't let them get away with things. And I think those three attributes of his combined are really what have led people to sort of long for him a lot. And when I was going back through the book, I started to go back through some of his old interviews, and I sort of saw this prosecutorial just training that came from his law school days that would come out. And it all came back to me as sort of, I remember he would be sitting on his bed at night and he'd have a ball game on in the background, but there'd just be this huge, just stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of research. And as a young kid, I never sort of picked up, I was like, oh, my dad just reads a lot. And then going through later on, I realized, my goodness, he literally would prepare for that 40-minute, 20-minute interview, however, on Sunday, going back to Tuesday, reading every single article, reading every single thing he could find on this politician or this policymaker before he went into it. And that type of dedication, I think, is not seen as much anymore in journalism for a variety of factors. I think people are so caught up in how the speed of social media operates that they don't sit back and actually do the research, mainly because they don't have the time. They're trying to maintain this 24/7 presence. It's also a different era now in towards politicians sort of speak in these sound bites, and they don't want to subject themselves to a long, grueling interview. They'd rather go on to a favorable cable station and speak for 3 or 4 minutes, or if they go on a network, they don't want it to be longer than 8 minutes because they just want to be able to stay in that zone and run out the clock. And I think, sadly, we've allowed them to do that, sort of just because there's less barriers now between a politician getting his message out with social media and the internet than there used to be. So I'll sort of finish up with this. The one thing I'll say on Father's Day with regards to my father is, going back to what I said earlier, is I feel we live in a very materialistic sort of consumer culture these days where a lot of young people, it's sort of off-putting to me. They value material things, and they see things on Facebook or Twitter, and they sort of, I want that, or I need that, or that's what life's about. And the most important lesson my father ever gave me was, you're always loved, but you're never entitled. And one thing that really stuck out to me, going back to what I said earlier about time, was that I realized not every father can give their kid time. People do have to work. Some fathers have a lot of jobs, and mothers too. But if there's this sense of being genuine about your time, that I feel everybody can do. And it doesn't mean you have to be rich to do that. It doesn't mean you have to be around 24/7. But if a child sincerely feels that you're there and that you care, it means a great deal. And if you give them your time in that respect, and you also remind them that they're not the most important thing in the world, that they need to be kind and respectful and tamp down the ego a little bit, that goes a long way. So if he was here, he would tell you that. And I also think, lastly, he would just sort of say we're a culture now where you're sort of seeing 1/3 of American children growing up without a father around, or not in a two-parent household. And fatherhood's a very important responsibility that I sincerely feel, if he was here, he would say for all to get involved in any way you can. And obviously people get divorced, and there's certain social things that occur. But if you make that commitment to have a child, staying as involved as possible is a very, very important thing. Because I know I'm a much better person for having my father for 22 years. I can't even imagine not having him for that amount of time. So thank you all so much for coming on Father's Day, and I'd love to hear your questions. I'm happy to talk politics. How did I talk to my father? Happy to talk sports, music, whatever you want. Throw it at me. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to ask a current political question, if I may.
Sure.
The other day you asked Speaker Boehner if Eric Cantor's loss meant there'd be no progress on immigration reform.
Yeah.
Do you think, what do you think the Speaker will do? I mean, is he giving up on immigration reform?
I don't think they'll move it this year. I think what they'll end up doing is they'll say we're going to look, and maybe we do something piecemeal. But what they claim, at least on the House side, for not moving a bill is two things. They say we won't move until the border's secure, and we don't trust the president. How do you quantify border security? It's a hard thing to do. Bob Corker, a Republican senator of Tennessee, he said the amount of money that went towards border security in the bipartisan Senate bill was probably overkill. That's not enough for the House GOP. When you ask them specifically, what does it mean to secure the border, I've asked that for the last year and a half. I haven't gotten a straight answer about it. And that's mainly because they don't want to move on it. So if they set sort of a line in the sand, I think the president at this point in his career would be willing to sort of go there. If they said, we'll have immigration reform and we have to have a moat with alligators and night vision drones, I'm sure they would say, fine, let's do it. And they don't want to move on that. Secondly, in terms of trusting the president, that was something that was also, you would point to examples, and the only example would be, well, he changed things regarding the health care law by executive order that we were not necessarily comfortable with, and we think that's how he'd operate under a comprehensive immigration reform bill. That's sort of, it's a decently fair point. However, although it's not related, the Bo Bergdahl swap, because Congress felt slighted by that, the first thing that Boehner and Cantor and those guys said was, see, this is why we can't trust him on immigration reform, because we can't trust him on these issues of foreign policy related to this. If he briefed 80 to 90 members of the administration before he briefed us, how can we trust him on immigration? So while that has nothing to do with immigration reform, interestingly enough, I think it's one thing the White House didn't realize that really hurt them in terms of their credibility with the House GOP conference. Politically, as John McCain said, if the Republican Party doesn't moderate on the issue, they're in a lot of trouble moving forward. But from the House side, there's only about 40 or so districts that have 20% or more Latinos in them specifically. So out of the 230 plus GOP members, it's not a sizable number for them to get really worried. And they're more worried about being outflanked on the right. So we'll see what happens. I don't think it happens this year. And quite frankly, I think the person who was here last Friday, Hillary Clinton, it probably helps her a lot if she runs for president, because the Democrats can seize the issue and own the issue and states, there's a bunch of swing states, Colorado, New Mexico, Florida, Virginia, where Latinos are a sizable amount of the population. But watch out for Texas. I mean, it's not going to happen this election or the next one, but maybe by 2024, you could see a purple Texas if enough Latinos register. And I assume by that point it would have occurred, the moderation will happen, because if, heaven forbid, if Texas is ever becomes a swing state for Republicans, if you're the Democrats, California, Texas, New York, Illinois, you could basically lose everything else and just pick up the usual liberal states and you're fine. So they have to do it by that point.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for coming. I saw you today on Meet the Press.
Thank you. It's an honor to be there.
You were terrific. One of the wonderful things about your father was the way in which he could analyze and get to the essence of issues, and he was very issue oriented, and the show was very issue oriented. His whole approach to politics was issue oriented. But what's happened since then, at least in my opinion, is that politics has become more like sports or entertainment. It's
Right.
who's up, who's down. How does this affect the Republicans? How does this affect the Democrats? Without a lot of issue-oriented analysis and discussion and putting it to, as your father so ably did, put it to politicians on the issues. Why do you think our politics has become, in a sense, so superficial and so much like entertainment rather than the essence of politics,
There's
which
a few
is really
reasons.
policy?
There's a few reasons. I think number one is the media landscape for covering politics is oversaturated. So it used to be you had the main newspapers and the four networks, and CNN and Fox News and MSNBC. Now you have things like Politico, which is, they say openly at Politico, we want to be the ESPN of politics. So they're not getting really deep into the issues. They're sort of giving you the constant update, and people like that. They like to see the horse race play out, at least in terms of where their advertising dollars go. So I think that's one reason, is that you've had all these newcomers come in the digital age, which have sped things up, and people, sadly, a lot of people my age, they'll go through things on their iPads and their cell phones, and they're not reading long, drawn-out, sort of complicated stories about the issue, hearing from both sides, getting to the crux of it, looking at it historically. They kind of want the quick, hitting, oh, this is what I need to know right now. From a TV standpoint, I would just tell you it's kind of affected by the same mindset, where people think that we have to have a program that has a bunch of quick-hitting 5 or 4 minute interviews, a bunch of graphics, and we'll bring in this expert and that expert and blah, 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 blah. I think we're less for it personally in the media. I like the way my father would have those long interviews. I like what Charlie Rose is still able to do on his program. I think it's important. And as far as for the rating standpoint, it can be done in an effective way. It just takes someone who's willing to do that long, drawn-out research, and it takes networks wanting to not just follow what's hot at the moment. And that's a lot more difficult to do these days. Because what I've noticed is there's a sort of groupthink that goes through the media where things happen on Twitter. So something comes up, an issue. I'll give you a great example. I was sent to cover a hot air balloon accident. Sometimes I do non-political stories. A hot air balloon accident in Doswell, Virginia, 3 weeks ago. All right, that's a decent story. It's terrible. 3 people passed away. But the way in which they went about covering it is because it was going all around the internet. Oh my gosh, a hot air balloon went down in Virginia. It's like spreading like wildfire. You would have thought there was a terrorist attack or something. Well, hot air balloons have gone down in the history of the United States. It's bad, but it's not a plane crash. It's not the worst thing of all time. So that's what happens, is that one media outlet goes with it so hard on that Friday night, and everyone wants to play catch up. So when you do that, you don't plan out that interview about the issue. You don't plan out taking the time to, for example, let's examine what's happening in Iraq. Why is that happening? That goes back at least 50 years. But that should be brought up. But it's not, because it doesn't fit into what the current environment is and the current conventional wisdom. So maybe that changes, hopefully.
Thank you.
We'll see. Thank you. Anybody else? Oh, yes, sir.
Hey, Luke, how are you? You're
Good.
a lot older than I used to watch you with your dad, watching you play games.
I wish I could still play.
Of course, as you know, this is not just the 10th anniversary of the book. It's the 10th anniversary of the dedication of the World War II Memorial.
Yeah.
And as you know, your dad was the host and narrator of the film that
Sure.
my partner and I made about that. I'm sure you have a copy, but I've got one here.
Thank you.
But I want to tell a little story, just a quick story.
Please.
He was a last-minute substitute. Probably never. I've never told this in public.
For Brokaw or for who?
Brokaw and Tom Hanks.
Okay. Wow.
And so at the last minute, we called your dad, and he said he'd
That's
be
a
happy.
tough act to follow.
He did a pretty good job.
Yeah.
And it was just recently rebroadcast on Maryland Public Television. It will be
Right.
broadcast forever. So your dad will be on there forever. But as you know, one of the people that after the opening stand-up he did in front of the memorial,
Yeah.
and then narration, you'll see a scene where he's in the memorial, and you look very close, you can see, and he had gone in after the stand-up and said, "Do you guys mind if I call my dad?"
Yeah.
He went into the memorial. It was not yet open to the public. So there's one man in the memorial, and it's your dad sitting there talking to his dad.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to relate that story.
I
here.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
No, this book obviously is very much about my dad's relationship with his father, Big Russ. And Big Russ passed away about a year after my dad did. And he dropped out of high school and joined the Army, fought in World War II. And he didn't talk about the war that much. His B-52 Liberator went down in England, and he was one of half the plane survived, and he was fortunate enough to survive.
B-24.
B-24, sorry. No, good history, man.
Well, we made the film with your dad, so
Yeah,
we know all the details.
they would both be angry at me for messing that up. So good is good. But what's funny is what I learned from him was just sort of a common decency, and that sadly I think is sort of has gone away. That generation is very full of that. I've been fortunate enough in the House of Representatives to cover John Dingell and Ralph Hall, who are the last two World War II veterans who are still alive in Congress. And one thing they said is that it would be really hard to get so angry at somebody and think they were so worthless as a person if you fought and died in blood with them. And so it's a real neat thing to see. Is I would sometimes go with my grandfather to the American Legion, and just the way the camaraderie those guys had and the way they interacted, it's something I wish we still had, and probably not see again. But thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it.
And I've got another copy
I will
here.
grab it.
Another copy here for you.
Good man.
I'll be over here.
Thank you.
And you don't have to buy it from PBS Home Video.
Thank you.
This is a courtesy.
Sure you
The rest
book.
of you do.
Yes, ma'am.
What caused your dad to hold such a feeling for Buffalo, New York, and do you still feel so?
Me personally, yes, I love Buffalo.
Luke, can you just
Oh.
repeat the question?
So the question is, what caused my father to have such an affinity for Buffalo, New York? And you know, I still have that myself. So my father was born in South Buffalo. He lived there until he went off to college at John Carroll. Then he came back for a few years. But before he was ever involved in TV news, he got involved in local Buffalo politics and then used that to work for Senator Moynihan and eventually for Governor Cuomo. So I think part of his affinity for Buffalo is my father was always a hometown guy. He always liked to root for the home team, and he didn't like people who were disloyal to their own hometowns. Even if you had a bad experience, don't badmouth it. And growing up, Buffalo was a significantly different place than it was today. There was a point at the turn of the century where they had the World's Fair back in the early 1900s. Buffalo was the fourth largest city in America. It was a manufacturing powerhouse. No, it was bigger. It was bigger. Yeah, it was bigger. So he grew up when Buffalo was still decently vibrant. And then sadly, as he got into politics, he started sort of seal closings in the 70s and whatnot. But when he worked for Moynihan and he worked for Cuomo, so many people he dealt with were New York City and Long Island, and they just had a complete lack of respect for Buffalo. And I think that always stuck with him. And he said, "You're not better than we are. You don't deserve to speak down to us. We're a very important part of the state. We're the second largest city in the state. We're very important." And that never left him. And I think one story that he tells in this book is in his first few weeks on Capitol Hill working for Senator Moynihan, he was very intimidated because a lot of the people he worked with were from New York City. They were Harvard educated, Ivy League educated. And he said, Senator Moynihan called him in and he goes, how are you doing? And he goes, I got to tell you, Senator, this has been pretty tough for me, and I don't know if I'm necessarily cut out for this. And Moynihan looked him in the eye and he goes, what they have, you can learn. What you have, they will never have. And that was a basic understanding of people, and that's a basic common decency that I think comes from Buffalo, a city of good neighbors. Me personally, I would spend a lot of summers there, spend a lot of Thanksgivings there. I'm a diehard Buffalo Bills fan, a diehard Sabres fan. I try and go back a few times a year. I think it's a very important part of my life. One reason why I like Buffalo so much, though, is I feel people forget about the Rust Belt in America now, sadly. But thankfully, Buffalo is mounting a comeback. They've done a good job. Yeah, they're getting there. They've done a good job of replicating what Pittsburgh did and sort of getting biotech and big healthcare to come in, and they're starting that Buffalo University Health Campus downtown. Hopefully there's a stadium built down there that can further gentrify some of the areas. And it's you got to believe, right? And Buffalo is a great place to do that. So go Bills. Good to see you here.
So, Luke, a lot of kids go into the same businesses as their dads, and a lot
Yeah.
of kids don't.
Yeah.
Because it's Father's Day. Could you reflect on what it's been like for you to follow in your dad's footsteps?
Well, I grew up in a very, shall we say, journalist-heavy family. My mother, who's far and away the best writer in the family, she's a writer for Vanity Fair, Maureen North, and I was an only child. So when you're an only child, you're surrounded a lot more by adults than you are by kids your own age a lot of the time, because your parents' friends will come over and you'll sit there. So I would just sort of be like a sponge at the family dinner table. And I see Al Hunt here, the great Al Hunt, formerly the Wall Street Journal, now Bloomberg. He was a guest there and soak up knowledge from people like him. And I always knew growing up that I liked the medium of TV. I also liked journalism. I thought it was a very noble profession. I thought, if nothing else, my parents informed people. My own friends would come over. They would always ask my dad questions and my mom questions about history or about what was going on. And I liked being the kid who had the answers at school. And I remember there was a big news story. Kids would ask me, so what's happening here? What's your dad say? What's your mom say? I was more drawn originally to sports. And I started off in sports radio in college. And that's something where I thought I'd go a little bit. And then in around 2005, when Katrina hit, that made me reflect that perhaps with, it's written in Luke's gospel, much is given, much is expected, I should pay more attention to public affairs. And that, and with the Iraq War as it played out in 06 and 07, and then the 08 election, those moments sort of directed me into, you can still do sports, but definitely educate yourself about the issues of the day because they're extremely important. And then after my father passed, prior to that, I'd been working on doing some stuff about youth issues, and people saw me speak at his eulogy. They're like, oh, this is a young person who's okay on television. He doesn't get intimidated. And would you mind doing a few things? And I said, sure. And then after that, I kind of went away for a little while, and I said, I want to learn how to do something. So I took about 4 or 5 months off camera when I first went to the Hill, and was a sponge up there and sort of came in the realm of a producer. And that was a very important time for me, because I didn't have to worry about being on TV. I didn't have to worry about criticism, some of it fair, some of it unfair. And that just, great thing about Capitol Hill is the perfect place to be when you're 23, because everyone's the same age. Because no one in their right mind would work for that salary if they're older than 30 up there. So you meet a lot of kids who, you meet press secretaries who are 23 years old, and you guys kind of both learn on the job, the press secretary and the journalist, and you have journalists who are the same age and writers. So that was a wonderful experience for me. But following my father's footsteps, is I've always said I'm not in any way trying to be as good as he was. It's not going to happen. I mean, he's a legend. He's a legend. But if I can go out there and do something that I enjoy doing, and I feel I do a respectable job, and as he always said, don't embarrass the family name, and God willing, I haven't done that yet. So yeah, there's a lot of pressure there, but I enjoy it at the end of the day because I still like to be able to inform people. I find that enjoyable. Anybody else? Oh,
Yes,
good.
thank you. First of all, just your father, in addition to the three things that you mentioned, he was also, to me, a very authentic, which
Yeah.
is unusual. He never steered away from that. You always felt what he was saying and how he was saying was real and what he believed, which is missing today. So just to remind you of that from my perspective. But I would really like to hear a little of the authentic, Tim Russert. A few stories that you might be feeling comfortable in revealing to us. I know that you say he cared, and what a great father he was, but maybe a few stories as a son that you can recall of what he was like, both as a father and as a man.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for the question. One that jumps up to mind, I see my old English teacher here, Dr. Piazza. Thank you so much for coming. Everyone will critique my grammar after the session. My father, as I mentioned earlier, he made a real effort to know what was happening to me at school. So he would want to know, do you have a test this week? What are your papers? When are your papers due? He took a real interest in that. And one thing I can tell you is my freshman year of high school, I just had an awful time with geometry. I just couldn't do it. And I tried everything. I tried a tutor. I tried getting to school at 6:30 to work with the teacher. Just everything. And it's just one of those things that just wouldn't click for whatever reason. I'll never touch a geometry textbook ever again in my life. So first semester, I didn't pass. And second semester, I had to do quite well or decently well in order to avoid summer school. And here's this guy who's so incredibly busy, and he came into my room and he goes, "We're not going to summer school. Let's do this." So he goes, "We're going to figure this out." And I just remember he'd come back and he'd be so tired, and he'd be like, "Let's go through the problems one more time. Let's go through the lessons one more time. Let's go. I'm bringing." He would drive me himself to school. At 6:30 in the morning, sometimes before we had to go do the Today Show. And I remember we would just go on, and then finally, the last day when I had to take the final exam, I was a little bit nervous, and as I get out the car, he looked at me and he goes, "It's all right if you don't make it. We can stay here in the summer." And that just, I'm sorry, choke up for talking that, but it just shows you how much he cared and how much he meant. And that was real. That was real. And working in TV news, coming home to your kids' impossible geometry textbook, I say, it's the last thing in the world you want to do. Yeah, sure. No, go ahead. Yeah, I'll repeat it. Yeah. But you did hire a tutor. Yeah, that was in addition to the tutor. Right. See, I think a lot of parents would say, "I bought you the tutor. Why couldn't you do it?" Yeah, just the tutor, and then blame the tutor, and then it was never your fault, right? But yeah, so that was a moment. The other one I'll tell you is when I was up in college. I think that was a difficult thing for both of us originally because it was the first time we had never really truly lived apart, and he could tell sometimes in my voice, especially first semester, if I was enjoying myself, but I was missing him, or I was a little unsure of myself and whatnot. And I remember one time he just calls up. He goes, "Hey, BC's playing West Virginia at noon. It should be a good game." I said, "Yeah, I know. It'd just be good." He goes, "All right." He goes, "What are you and your friends doing?" I said, "Oh, there's this tailgate around the way. We'll be there." And he goes, "All right." And he just showed up. And I had had a tough week, and it just meant the world. And it's that, those sort of times. And that's an authentic love that I think fathers have for their sons and sons have for their dads. But to see that play out is extraordinary. And, there's just little things like that, and I go back to the time, which shows that you really care. And along the way, he'd send me, if there's interesting newspaper clippings, he'd send it out and clip it out. I'm sure no one does that anymore. You send the internet, link. But that showed, I've always felt authentic, and that was nice. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Luke.
Hi.
What is your all-time favorite memory of your father?
There's a lot. I would say the one story I like to tell that sticks out to me, I don't know if it's my all-time favorite, but it's one that I never forget, is my father was never really intimidated by anybody. You know, he interviewed popes and presidents, and he was always ready to go. His two heroes in life, besides from his own dad, were Yogi Berra and Bruce Springsteen. And I got to be there when he met both of them, different times. And the first time he met Yogi Berra, and Yogi Berra goes, "Oh, I know who you are. You know, I see you on TV with Tom Brokaw," and he couldn't speak. He literally couldn't speak, and so that was neat to see. And then when he met Bruce Springsteen, it was just because Springsteen's was a big fan of my father, and it was two of them in the room, and they both couldn't speak to each other. And they kind of just stared at each other for about 35 seconds, and then they started making small talk in there. But that was a really neat thing to see for me personally. Because to see your own father, who's, you know, a lot of fathers, like, in front of their sons, they like to exude confidence and strength, and, you know, we're all good. And to see him speechless was pretty neat from a professional standpoint. And then for me personally, it's kind of what I was talking about. Just tons of little stories like that of him just being there and caring and making me feel good.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's one right there.
I was glad you mentioned your college experience.
Yeah.
And I looked on our bookshelf and I found this other book by your dad,
Wisdom of Our Fathers.
The Wisdom of Our
Yeah.
Fathers, which is
Right.
another great Father's Day book. But in his epilogue, he talks about you going off to college, and there's a great picture of the two of you, and just and how that separation was just
It's real.
so
Yeah.
hard for him as well. And I just wanted to say that was a great testament to you as well.
Thank you very
and
much.
your relationship.
Thank you. It was interesting is my dad called his father when I first went away to school, and my grandfather said to him, which I found so poignant, that he's probably having just as difficult a time as you are. And my dad never thought about that. You know, my father thought, like, I was partying and having the greatest time of my life, and I was away from home, and, you know, that's what young kids did. But no, it's very true. Braves fan, oh God.
So, like you and your dad, I'm actually from Georgia, so I can't give up the home.
That's fine.
So
God love you then.
we can debate, who's going to win the East
Right on.
afterwards. But actually, I was just curious. I got to think with your dad, it was pretty hard to win an argument, and given his ability to debate and research. Was there ever a moment where you had, a debate and you came away thinking?
Well,
Yes,
interestingly enough, you know, like every kid, you go back at your parents every now and then. And he was a pretty reasonable guy. Now my parents were strict in the sense, you know, I had a curfew. I couldn't, run around town. You know, they were very strict about, no drinking and no driving. But in terms of arguing with him from a political standpoint, I would never win one of those. And I tried on occasion. And it'd be great because he would sort of prep me. We would sometimes have in school these debates, and he would prep me. And he would, I would be defending a position at the St. Albans Government Club. I was a member. And there would be an issue, and we were debated. And so he goes, "You want to practice?" I said, "Sure." And he'd start off decently easy, go back and forth. There's sometimes my mom would be like, "All right, let's lighten up, Tim," like, because he knew the issues so well. So no, that's a very tough one. And if you go back through episodes of Meet the Press, it's really hard to find someone that knocked him off his feet. There are some good battles between him and Dick Cheney. There's some good battles between him and Howard Dean, where you can see like Dean surprises him. You might not know it if you don't know him, but you can kind of see he did this thing where if he was kind of shocked, he'd kind of look down like this, like very, damn, yeah. But that doesn't happen. That didn't happen a lot, and it didn't happen with me. Now, if I was arguing for something like later curfew, or if I was arguing to, why I should be allowed to use the car, he would be reasonable about that. I won some of those arguments, but not all.
I'm sorry, I don't mean.
One more, yeah.
I just don't mean. But your Yogi story when we had.
Yeah.
We had to call your dad 2 days before when the narration had to be done, and there was
Yogi
a very small
Berra,
window.
a Normandy veteran, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's one of the ways we got him. We did some research. How are you going to get Tim Russert in 2 days to do this?
Oh, yeah.
His schedule and all that. We did some research, and we found out that he was a Yogi fan.
Oh, yeah.
He said that Yogi is in the film because he was actually at the front of the first wave. Yogi
Yeah.
Berra, and he's in the film. But we also told him we had Warren Spahn.
Oh, yeah.
In the
Buffalo
film.
guy.
He was a Buffalo guy.
Right.
And we told him the story about Warren Spahn saying, "I'm from Buffalo. I thought I knew cold. I didn't know cold until I got to the Battle of the Bulge."
Yeah, I believe that.
And I'll tell you the other story that we told your dad
Yeah.
later
Yeah.
about Spahn. And those were he said that's great. I have to do this. I was going to do it anyway, but the Yogi and Warren Spahn, I'll be there.
Those old baseball players were really special for my father, and he got to meet a lot of them later on in his life. People asked him to be on boards in different charitable organizations, and he would do a lot for the Boys and Girls Club and Catholic charities, but he didn't do anything else. Except the Baseball Hall of Fame asked him to be on the board. He goes, "Oh, I could make time for that one." So, yeah, I'll go to Cooperstown for one.
By the way, he said you don't have to pay me. He said no, you're a professional. We do, even though we're PBS with
Yeah.
limited budget. And we wrote. He said just write the check to the Boys
Ah,
Club.
see,
So there
that's
you go.
good. And a portion of the proceeds of this book go to the Boys and Girls Club as well. So it's a wonderful charity. Anybody else? You? No? We done? All right. Start signing then. Thank you very much for coming out.